are right now in a new discussion about the epistemology and testimony in our modern world, and a new schools. These schools echo the early debate happened in the early Muslim history. And then we can witness different camps, reductionist and non-reductionist, and most importantly, the schools of hybrid viewpoints. Here we can see a rich literature on the epistemology of testimony, and there is many overlapping and relationship between this field, epistemology of testimony, and also the rich Muslim tradition in the early period. So as I said, this is a very important shift for me, just to go outside of the traditional discussion, and also from what we can see in Western scholarship in the Hadith. So like when we go to the Muslim world and discuss all of these issues and all of like points and criticism coming from the Western world, so they discuss that based on like a different platform and different methodology. And also here in the in the Western scholarship, mostly based on the historical critical methodology. So this discussion and this paper attempt to elevate and transcend the discussion among these people in the Western world and Eastern world, Muslim world, to a new space, a new place is epistemology of testimony. And this, I think it's a safe place, and this a place that we need to locate the study of hadith, especially in the formative period and the early period. Is not about like hadith is not based on the historical critical studies or based on other methodologies that we can witness now, because everything about hadith, all these debates about hadith in the formative period and the early period about the epistemology of testimony, and this are very rich. So anyone looking and reading this literature in the early period of Islam will witness and see that obviously. So I don't know if I can make this argument, but I read also a few years ago about, I read a paper, a small paper by Edward Said called Return to Philology. So this, for me, it's like, it's not return to epistemology, but re-establishing epistemology in the ilm of hadith. So, and giving a consideration for the epistemology in this field. And going out and leaving out the traditional discussion among Western people and also Muslim world on the traditional discussion, and to this new place, epistemology of testimony, and thinking how we can receive testimony in our daily life. So because like, as we can see in our family, children receive any report in different way from adults. So then this, like, how we can understand reductionist and non-reductionist people. So all of these people giving examples from our daily life, and how we can understand these reports from, like, coming from like a hadith. And this hadith also is, we can consider as a special report. And this why also, especially like David Hume consider epistemology of testimony, the whole discussion about he refused the testimony and considered as reductionist in terms of the reports of miracles. But then, as I said, the discussion opened for not not only reports of prophets, and for a wider concept of report. So,
Isam, you're doing a whole new paper for us here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So just very briefly, I just want to say this: this paper attempts to put these two traditions into conversation with one another. That's all.
And Mohammed Safi, do you want to say something at this point?
Yeah. Hi. First of all, thank you for having me. I'll try to keep it short. It's about 11:30 here in Cyprus, where I'm recording from, or where I'm live from. But I just wanted to say, in terms of my own interest in the paper and kind of what got me involved, and kind of where I'm kind of situated at, and why, I decided to work on it with Dr. Islam, it particularly has to do with kind of my interests of hadith as an ongoing kind of living field, right? And that some of those questions that are, constantly being asked, even in kind of contemporary times, I always saw them as epistemological questions. And so, within kind of Islamic intellectual history, you don't really see epistemology as its own standalone field. And that's pretty normal, even in kind of other civilizations. Epistemology developed that as its own field later on. And so testimony to me is kind of a place of contact. It's not the only set of questions that one would have to ask if they were studying hadith epistemologically, but it's a good place to start. And it's a complicated field itself, just like any field is. And this paper is actually what kind of drew me out to start reading in testimony and to connect with professors, in other parts of the world, and kind of what drew me to, spending hopefully some time working at it. And hopefully my dissertation will be focusing on this. I don't want to take more time since, I don't want to take a lot of your time, and I'll try to keep my comments short. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Asma, you want to do it now or you want to hold it?
You know what, I'll go ahead, because I don't want to.
Let me introduce you briefly. Asma's returning to the Middle East Institute here. Actually, we had the pleasure of having her with us as a fellow. That was a year ago. And there may be through Zoom in any case, right? She's an associate professor in Near Eastern languages and cultures and a program director of Islamic studies at UCLA. And she has a very important book called Women and the Transmission of Religious Knowledge in Islam. Please, Asma Said.
Thank you very much, Rick. Actually, now I think it was 2 years ago, but I feel like last year didn't happen. Anyhow, thank you again for inviting me to be a part of this. I have to say, it's really wonderful to see colleagues here, Mohammed, to make your acquaintance via Zoom. Isam especially, who I came to know in Syria first in 2010 when I was there in a Fulbright. And the brief comment I'll make here, I think, connects to some of the conversations we had in Syria. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I was actually reading some of these works that the article deals with closely with Isam in Syria. And one of the conversations we actually had back in 2010, if you might remember, Isam, is about his desire to bring together Western methodologies and approaches to the study of hadith with sort of classical Islamic approaches to the intellectual tradition. And I think that, both of you have done a remarkable job of doing just that here. So it was fascinating for me to see the ways in which you brought these conversations about epistemology, about the philosophical elements of dealing with testimony together in this article. And I really enjoyed that. As I said, I have a number of really technical questions, but I think I'll start with my broadest one, which is that, I definitely appreciate your focus here on epistemology and testimony, and I can see why it makes sense given your desire to bring these two intellectual traditions or methodologies together. But I'm also concerned that, what we walk away with from this article is an idea that Bukhari in particular, and in his Sahih, focused primarily on isnad criticism, on the rijal, right? And I think that there are enough, there are enough works, including those of Jack Brown's, that have, sort of forced us to think about other aspects of the ways in which he engaged with this tradition, specifically matan criticism. And I wonder about the ways in which, the conclusions of your article might undermine, or how they connect, let's say, to put it more in a more neutral terms, how they connect with recent trajectories that do talk about matan criticism and do take the focus away from, testimony and understanding the narrators and, those sorts of issues. So I'll start there. Like I said, I have other questions, but they're much more specific.
Okay. Do you want to have some more comments? And do you want to gather up the comments, or do you want to take them commenter by commenter?
So I think this is a very important point, and I think why we are focusing maybe in Isnad criticism, because this really is the nature of Sahih al-Bukhari and the nature of the Bukhari methodology himself. So and then how we can focus like Metin criticism in terms of epistemology of testimony. I think this really if I understand correctly, needs another study, and it's not easy to do that studies for Sahih al-Bukhari. But I mentioned something, maybe I don't know if that's related in my footnotes, about some hadith left out from Sahih al-Bukhari intentionally, in purpose. Bukhari himself did not mention these hadiths and just like put tarajim, and then other commentators put these, and editors put these hadiths under his tarajim, under his headings. So I think this is something maybe we need to discover in Sahih al-Bukhari, and because Sahih al-Bukhari itself, yes, we know that his methodology based on Isnad, and also I mentioned in the book, in the paper, that he has a plan also for his fiqh, and this like a book for his fiqh, to provide a book explaining his fiqh. So I don't know. So just like Asma, I just want to know that you are asking like, or your comment to see how there is overlapping between Metin criticism and epistemology of testimony.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm asking, the ways in which this article and your findings intersect or don't with other scholarship in the field that focuses more on Metin criticism. And I read Jack Brown's article several years ago, so I don't actually remember if you deal with Sahih al-Bukhari in that or with other works, but I feel that in some ways, it may be an unintended outcome, but one of the outcomes of this article and your analysis is just to reify this view that Muslim Hadith scholars were first and foremost concerned with the narrators, and then it didn't really matter, once they established their veracity, and as sources of truth, that didn't really matter what the content was. And I'm not sure that is, what you intend to do through this. And I may have missed something in the article, but yeah, that's where my question is coming from.
Mohammed, do you want to respond?
Sure. I mean, I can offer maybe a couple comments. First of all, I read both of Dr. Brown's articles. I think he has at least two. There might be more about content criticism. And I agree with you that that's an important part of Hadith studies and something to focus on. I would hope that the article doesn't give that vibe off. All I would say is that as Dr. Isam was saying, it's another area that needs to be further kind of flushed out if we're going to talk about epistemology. Personally, I lean towards kind of a view of like a division of labor that occurred over into Islamic intellectual history with this question. In other words, it's not that Hadith scholars didn't engage in some form of Metin criticism, but as I think Dr. Brown notes in one of the two articles, they didn't really have an established critical apparatus to deal with the content of reports in any type of methodological way, the way that we can say they did maybe with Isnad criticism. And so personally, I think kind of the division of labor across the Islamic sciences, and even if we don't look at Hadith scholars as only in those 300 years, I think that's often something that's also done, is that we kind of look at Hadith scholarship as kind of 15, 20 people, as opposed to over the 1400 years. I think it gives a more rich understanding of what's happening intellectually.
So shall we get another question? Or Asma, do you want to ask another one of your detailed questions?
No, let's move on, and I'll come back to those if they seem relevant to the discussion.
Okay, so let me introduce the man who has been referred to already several times, Jonathan Brown. He's returning also in a different role for the Sharia workshop, but he's been here and around a real table. So he's the author, he's first of all the Awalid bin Talal Chair of Islamic Civilization at Georgetown University. And he's the author of a number of books. I'll just mention three, which are especially relevant here. Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, The Canonization of al-Bukhari and Muslim, and Misquoting Muhammad, The Challenges and Choices of Interpreting the Prophet's Legacy. Jack, thanks.
Thanks, Brink, for inviting me. You know, you many years ago took pity on me and took me seriously as a scholar, for which I'm still grateful. You know, and being invited to participate is a big honor. So you guys can hear me, right? Correct? All right. So I'll also say I'd like to note that I think Scott and I are in the same hair situation. I think that needs to be noted. And Scott actually used to have a ponytail. So this is actually him going back to his teenage years, as it is for me. So in some ways, this pandemic, if you might think about it, is a way of revisiting youth. Okay, well, that's enough of that. So, so I would, first of all, I mean, I'm not in a position to, you know, critique this. You two are very skilled at this, and you know, I don't, you know, I think that, you know, you have really strong command of the literature, of the primary sources, and the Arabic language secondary sources, like the works of Abu Ghunda and rahimahullah and Sharif Hatim al-Auni. The one kind of, and I also don't know what kind of stage in the process this piece is. Has it already been published? Is it a draft? Is it going to be published in some other form? So I don't know if it's helpful to get the kind of feedback I'm going to give, but I would say one thing that struck me as I was reading it was, you know, and I know this is kind of an obnoxious thing to say, but I think in this case it might be appropriate. So what, right? I think like this is clearly really interesting for you two, and it's interesting for someone who's really has their head in this bucket, right? But I think that there's, you know, there's actually a lot more, you know, there's a lot more implication to what you're talking about, and I wish that you had or you could, you know, bring that out a little bit more for the reader who maybe is not as familiar with this specific subject matter. You know, why is this important? And not just because you're trying to kind of bring two traditions into conversation, but also because you know, this is supposed to tell us something about al-Bukhari and about his work. And I feel like you should be a little bit more, maybe put more weight in that. Then, you know, as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, you know, if only somebody had written a book like, you know, on like the canonization of a Bukhari or something. I mean, I don't know, maybe that book would have been useful, or, you know, maybe you could have cited it. I'm not sure, you know, I don't know. I don't think it's polite to sort of complain about not being cited, although apparently that's a major activity in our field now. So I would never do that, but I'm just saying maybe there's something out there you could look at. I don't know if your book Constructive Critics got cited. I can't remember if it was in the footnotes or not. So Scott, remember in my book on Hadith, I reproduced one of Scott's charts, and he's like, hey, that looks pretty familiar. And he was almost going to accuse me of plagiarism, but then he saw at the bottom a fat footnote saying, taken from Scott Lucas's book. But so the Constructive Critics book, also very useful. And also then, so that's one thing I would suggest. Then I would also say, and this is going to be, so you say on page, hang on, I should find it. Page of the PDF version I got, it was page 117. We do not have any clear text from Bukhari where he rejects a hadith because it contradicts his conception of the law, like we find in the school of Ibn Abban. And then on page, sorry, one second. On page 124, you say again, there is no textual evidence from Bukhari where he rejects a number of hadiths based upon a non-testimonial source of knowledge like reason or perception. So I'm not sure exactly what your definition of reason or perception is here, but we do have, I thought a really good article called How We Know Early Hadith Critics Did Metan Criticism and Why It's So Hard to Find. There's just a whole section on Bukhari and looking in his different books of transmitter criticism and showing instances where he rejects hadiths based on content. For example, he rejects a hadith that says that you should burn the spoils. If someone takes spoils of war unduly, that they should be burned. Bukhari says that we know that we don't burn spoils of war. And he says in another hadith that he criticizes that the Prophet said, don't break up coins that are in circulation amongst the Muslims. He said that this is not possible because the Muslims didn't mint coins until the time of Abdul Malik. In another hadith, he says that, that supposedly says the signs of the Day of Judgment will appear after the year 200. He says this is not true. The year 200 has already come and gone, and these signs haven't appeared. So there's, I think, a number of examples there where, certainly he's rejecting a hadith because it contradicts his understanding of the law, and also where he's contradicts, his historical reality to him, or sense perception in time. So I would, I think that I certainly would feel like qualifying those statements you made. I don't think this contradicts your work at all. I think it just gives you more data to talk about how he's not reductionist. And then the last thing I would say is that when you talk about the Muslims' discussion of the An hadith, that you should look at, if you haven't already seen it, Bilal Abbas's article in Islamic Law and Society. And I was actually trying to share it in the chat, but I couldn't do it because I lack the authority or whatever. But I can email it to you, or if I get the authority, I can just insert it in the chat for everybody. But Bilal Abbas's article, which is called, sorry, I keep it in the file between these, The Principles of Hadith Criticism in the Writing of the Shafi'i and Muslim, in the Islamic Law and Society 24, 2017, where he, he gets the biggest pat on the back I can imagine, or he should get a big pat on the back, which is that Bilal Abbas, I believe, has put an end to the debate about who the person that Muslim is criticizing. And it's Abu Hussein al-Karabisi, the kind of pseudo-Mu'tazilite, pseudo-Hadith scholar. So you should, if you haven't looked at that, I would certainly look at it. If you have looked at it and you don't want to use it, definitely cite it. And and then there's one more thing. I'm sorry to keep saying one more thing, but this is actually just, hopefully a helpful comment, which is that there's one line where you talk about, sorry, I just have to find it. You talk about, okay, here we go. On page 110, rather, he presents a solution of taking into consideration the past occurrences and etiology, which is known as hadith study, in hadith study, a study of hidden defects, or ilal. Oh, only one L in ilal there, obviously. But well, I didn't understand what that meant. Maybe I'm too stupid, but for the non-Mensa members out there, you can just maybe explain a bit more clearly what you mean in that sentence. And then a question, and I'm done, I promise. Last thing, I promise, which is, you talked about this virtuous loop, which I think was a great phrase, and this gets on something Scott, I'm sure, is wondering as well, which is, if you have a virtuous loop, is it a circular argument? I don't think it is. I have my own argument for why it isn't, but I would love to hear your argument for why a virtuous loop is not a self-reinforcing circular argument. Thank you very much.
Uh, Yes, so thank you, Jonathan, for these question and comments. Really helpful. So let me just like start with the first point about perception, and do we see any examples in Al-Bukhari for any hadith rejected by his perception? This, I think, if I recall correctly about perception here, since we speak about reductionism and non-reductionism. So for reductionism, if they said we need to verify any report, any testimony should be based on perception or senses, and there's no any room for testimony, even though in the background. So then, if al-Bukhari consider him right now like working on perception outside of report. So like if he reject any hadith in his book, like the examples that he mentioned, did he reject that based on senses and perception or based on other reports? So here, like just like to see reports contradicting other reports. So this, I found this maybe a very important discussion among reductionist and non-reductionist, because for non-reductionist or maybe hybrid viewpoint, consider a positive work by the hearer if he use the background and not just to reject this testimony based on another testimony. So the unity of testimonies, the body of testimonies, like to bring all these testimonies to reject one testimony. They consider this a positive works by hearer to support his rejection or his acceptance of this hadith. So then, just here maybe a question for all of these examples. So, and we need maybe to trace and study all of these examples. Did al-Bukhari accept or reject these hadiths based on his senses, perception, or just based on other reports or sunnah or maybe historical accounts based on testimony, not based on perception? So just I'm curious, like maybe to trace all of these examples that you mentioned and to see why al-Bukhari rejects that. I think this is a very important point to just like to check about Bilal Abbas and all of these articles that trace all of these opponents of these early works, Shafi'i and al-Bukhari and Muslim. This is a very important works, like to know who is the opponent on all of these works. And yes, and you know that Al-Awni himself, his massive work on Ijma' al-Muhaddithin, 14 evidence that al-Bukhari not intended or not meant by this discussion. And also Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudde confirms that, and also Dr. Nuruddin Atar confirms that, all of these scholars confirm that. So we know at least that al-Bukhari not meant by this discussion, but however, so when we discuss that, I did not want to locate who is the opponent in Muslim, but to see, okay, and that's why I put 4 possibilities, 4 scenarios. And if we consider like the first scenario, there is no evidence for meeting, or there is evidence for meeting, and there is a possibility for meeting, and then to see where we can locate the second and third scenario in the epistemology of testimony. And I found that Muslim, if we take the possibility of meeting between 2 narrators in two different generations, this considered just like accepted among the epistemologists and not rejected by them. And then al-Bukhari then right now consider stricter hybrid in this way. If al-Bukhari, Bukhari school to consider evidence for meeting, like meeting at least like in general. So, but however, that would be a good suggestion to read Abbas' article on this, on al-Karabisi. It seems al-Karabisi had many debates with many with many people, and one of them, this is a very important topic. And even though that, you know, that in traditional discussion, they refer not al-Karabisi, but refer here to al-Dhuhli, and I think Bukhari. I think al-Dhuhli and al-Bukhari, if I recall correctly. So about etiology and ilm al-ilal here considered as a background of evaluation, not so, because there are two ways to criticize any hadith, just like as kids and doing to accept and not accept, and there is the background is to use all of these tools, instruments to verify any hadith. And this what we can see al-Bukhari himself when he and Ali bin Madini and others collect all the transmissions and narrations to verify, reject, or accept any hadith. I hope that maybe you can explain more about this etiology, because it's a very important point. And for me, if you have any thought on that, since I read also your work on the importance and significance of ilal and how the Western scholarship did not focus or did not touch this literature, and this is a very important literature. And I see in this field and all of this, like the genre of su'alat and the genre of ilal, a lot of discussion we can see and overlapping between this genre and the epistemology of testimony, and specifically among the people of hybrid school. All of these schools of hybrid in the last decade, focusing on like the hidden flaws, the hidden defects that we can see in reports, and how like someone is truthful, but giving maybe a fake report because he knows the hearer would be lying. So then he giving this just to make the hearer giving the opposite, and then the testimony would be right. So then this a defect. So and this like the maybe the hidden flaws, how we can know that. So the hearer here truthful, and the speaker is truthful, but the hearer is untruthful, and the testimony is fake, but then in the end testimony is right. So I don't know if we can witness like these examples in the early literature. And you know that about Wadda'in and all of these people who made these fake hadiths and fabricated hadiths, they use these techniques and similar techniques in their work. Yes, I think this is what I recall from you. So.
Thanks. Mohammed, you want to add to that?
Sorry, I hope my voice is coming through too. I have really bad connection here in Cyprus. So first of all, thank you. I forgot to thank Dr. Sahih. Thank her also for her comments and her questions. And Dr. Brown, thank you also for yours. I don't really have anything to respond except to say that I'm also very interested in the question of how do we deal with this idea of narrator criticism and the whole kind of edifice that surrounds it. I also don't think it's a vicious circle. I think that's the right term.
Virtuous
one of the ways
circle. You said virtuous circle, not vicious.
Right. Virtuous is what's used in the paper.
You said virtuous. I said circular reasoning. I'm asking you to give your explanation of why that's not the case.
Right. I got you. Yeah, it's the virtuous loops in the paper. What I'm saying is not a vicious circle because the traditional kind of answer that's given is the idea that it at the end of the day, it goes back to these kind of central figures that are kind of, they're generally accepted across the board, right? But I think it needs to be unpacked. Like, I don't think that is, just easily answerable like that. But I think that the idea of authority and the place of authority, which is also an incredibly important kind of subtopic of testimony as a field of or subfield of epistemology, also needs to kind of be intersected here. And the role that authority plays within any testimonial knowledge that a person receives, whether that's authority in terms of expertise or authority, obviously, in terms of religious authority. A further point that I would add to that is the question of probability and what place this kind of probability play in all this. Is this kind of just increasing amounts of probability? These are very difficult conversations to have any type of easy answer to. These are all questions that are running through my own mind, but I thank you for all of your comments.
So
I unfortunately have to head to class, but it's been a really wonderful to see you all and be a part of this discussion. And I hope to connect with Isam and Mohammed as a follow-up to this this wonderful
Thank you.
presentation panel.
Thank you, Asma.
Thank you so much.
Hope
Take
you have
care.
hope you have energy left for the classroom.
Oh, it'll be fine. This gave me more energy, actually. This is very good. Thank you so much.
Thank
Take
you.
care, all. Bye.
So Scott Lucas, Associate Professor, School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies, and also in Religious Studies at the University of Arizona. And the book was mentioned, Constructive Critics, Hadith Literature and the Articulation of Sunni Islam in the Legacy of the Generation of Ibn Sa'ad, Ibn Ma'in, and Ibn Hanbal. Plus also, he has translated a number, I think it's 30 selections from Tabari. It's called the Comprehensive Exposition of the Interpretive Verses of the Quran, sort of parts of Tabari's tafsir, as I understand it. I'm hoping to look at it. I didn't really realize that existed. And in recent times, I know he's been giving lectures on Zaidi Quran commentary, and maybe even another one tomorrow or something like that. This week is filled with Zaidi commentary. Okay, so thanks. Please, Scott, I'm happy you're here. We were doubting.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for sharing the paper and writing such a rich article on Hadith. I think Hadith definitely deserves sophisticated analytical thought. Even if it goes over my head, it's still something that is very valuable. And so I'm going to focus on some of the maybe bigger questions that I'm hoping to get some feedback on, and maybe to push back a little bit about, I think, some of the assumptions about what Bukhari is doing there. So my first question is the purpose of using the analytical philosophy, which I think is fantastic. It's great to bring them together, but maybe sort of following up what Jack was saying, cool, right? We use analytical philosophy, but is the purpose, and I felt like in places in the chapter, you were saying the purpose was to help distinguish Bukhari from other hadith collections, meaning to help explain why is Bukhari's the best in the eyes of most Sunnis, why is Bukhari's the best? Is that a significant part of what you're trying to do here? Or is that just sort of like, well, it doesn't hurt to throw that in as well? So maybe you could answer that initially, please.
Yes, this is a very important question, since we receive a very rich literature about al-Bukhari himself, and always, like in Muslim world, saying that al-Bukhari cannot touched. So this, like, just to understand, to humanize the discussion, and just like to see, is there any room to understand, is there any tools, instruments outside the Muslim tradition, outside what we can read, especially in the late era, among the commentators like Ibn Hajar and Karmani, all of these important figures in the medieval era and the late era. So just like to understand what's the significance and why al-Bukhari took this authority or occupied this authority in the history, and to understand what the tools is, not to say al-Bukhari is good or bad, or his assumption good or bad, or correct or right, but it's just like to understand the reasoning and behind that, and to bring this philosophy, and especially the subfield, field philosophy, the epistemology of testimony, is just to shed light on that and to understand how we can locate. So sometimes it was not easy to locate al-Bukhari after reading all of these. Sometimes we see al-Bukhari reductionist, sometimes non-reductionist, sometimes like between them, sometimes beyond, sometimes using very light, shallow approach. So yes, it's just like to understand why.
Is it okay if I offer a couple of comments?
Please.
So I think I'll talk beyond just the paper. Thank you, Dr. Lucas, for your question and your comments and your positive feedback. I think for me, this idea of connecting, two fields, two traditions, this idea of like synthesis, right? It's kind of in contrast to analysis, is when you do that, you bring out new aspects that you wouldn't have thought about in the main area that you're focusing on. So I think that idea of just like analytically splitting something up so you can better understand it, sometimes when you connect things together, I think you better understand that. And so I think that's one of the kind of, for lack of a better word, the methodological reasons that I personally am interested in putting those two fields kind of into conversation with one another. Just like we use various methodologies, as Dr. Islam mentioned kind of in his opening points, to better understand things historically. And there are various kind of ways to do that. I think putting two fields into conversation with one another and connecting things that might otherwise not have been connected. I mean, you all know better than me that, you know, some of this language would have been very foreign, not just the fact that it's in English, to kind of those 300 years, right? So I don't think anyone's claiming that, you know, they would necessarily have been processing things the exact same way. But I think putting it into conversation with one another shows that underneath all of that, something is going on. There are assumptions. There are axioms, there are principles, and by putting them into conversation, our hope is to bring those about and to have kind of people working in these fields all over the place think about them in new ways.
Great. So thank you for that clarification. So if part of your project is to explain or maybe demystify why Bukhari is still a bestseller, why he rose to such prominence, I just would strongly encourage going beyond the idea that he was the most rigorous transmitter, because at the end of the day, we really don't know what his criteria were, right? He doesn't tell us, right? I think we can all agree that he doesn't tell us what his criteria are. So there's been interesting guesswork, and obviously the article deals with that to some degree. But just if anyone spends some time, and I haven't spent as much time as I'd like with Bukhari, there's a real sense of complexity that I don't feel when I'm looking at the other Kutub as-Sitta, with all due respect to the other books. I don't know if it's that the arguments are stronger, there's interesting material interwoven with the hadith. So it's not just a reference book of nice hadith. It's actually, Bukhari is thinking through stuff. He's making arguments. And I'm sure there's a better way to express that philosophically than using philosophical language. And I realize that's not the paper, and I'm not here to tell you what you should do instead of what was in the paper. But I would just, if that is your goal, I would urge you to go beyond this sort of trope that, oh, Bukhari, he was just the most rigorous, when we really don't know what exactly what he was doing. And then I would also like to, something I got a sense from the paper was you had sort of these three categories. The Mu'tazila, right, are reductionists because they have a creedal sort of requirement in order to be a reliable transmitter. The Hanafis have the requirement, or half of the Hanafis maybe, or some of the Hanafis have the requirement that you have to be a faqih, so they don't have to follow the hadith from Anas or Abu Hurairah, right? You can see that as kind of being a strategy for avoiding certain hadith. And Ibn Khuzaymah called them out for doing that, essentially, like, you know, they just don't want to follow the hadith that these Sahaba narrated. And then Bukhari doesn't really have the same filters. You say they have to believe, he's a little bit anti-irja. But if you really read the Sahih, there's stuff in there that shows he has very strong theological positions. And one thing I would just highlight, and I think they're as strong as the Mu'tazila theological positions were in elsewhere. One I just would like to highlight, I stumbled across back when I was, not to self-quote, working on my dissertation and book, is if you look at in Kitab Fada'il al-Ashab, under Manaqib Ali ibn Abi Talib, there are 3 or 4, you know, nice hadith that we would expect, but at the very last line there, Bukhari quotes Ibn Sirin saying, and I actually have the Arabic quote since this is a workshop and not a lecture to the general public. And what Ibn Sirin says, or what Bukhari quotes Ibn Sirin, who's the famous successor in Basra, he says, "Anna amata ma yurwa an Ali al-kadhib." That the majority, or amma, is that all, is that most, it's certainly more than the minority, right, of what is narrated on the authority of Ali is lies. That's a pretty serious principle. Now, is Bukhari, he doesn't say, I endorse this, but he certainly put it in the place where he's celebrating Ali. He puts in this line, this zinger, right, that says most of what is narrated, according to this early Tabari, on the authority of Ali's lies. So is that not a sort of filter that Bukhari maybe is using, that he doesn't write a book and says, here are my filters? And so I'd be curious what your response would be to that line in his Sahih.
Yeah, that's a very great example. And that's why I think Muhammad and me, we found a way how we can understand al-Bukhari criteria, shurut, and we categorize that into 3 categories. The first one, theoretical conditions, the second one, applied, and the third one is understood through induction. So in terms of theoretical conditions, the statements of al-Bukhari, I don't know if we consider this like a statement for his philosophy and accepting hadith or not accepting hadith. So is this like here giving here a general statement about one thing as he gave about irja in like the narrated statement through him. So this like giving here maybe his idea about all of these narrations, but we don't know exactly where he is in terms of this, like he using perception, he used historical accounts in terms of Ali bin Abi Talib, and what he's using exactly is using other reports, using other narrators, what's his source for this specifically. So I consider this like very stricter condition to reject maybe many reports narrated about Fada'il Ali or maybe Mathalib Ali. So the positive or negative, we don't know. So because here said عامة ما يروى عن علي من كذب. So this like عامة here referring to positive aspects of Ali or negative aspects of Ali. So we don't know exactly where he is. So we need.
Does I mean on the authority of Ali, or does it mean like about Ali? Right? There's, I mean, yeah, I guess.
Right. So yes. So this it's when we don't see any pronounce any mantuq, like we use this like in usul al-fiqh, the mantuq and mafhum. So most statements about al-Bukhari we collect from mafhum, and not from early narrators through him, mostly like coming in medieval era and later. So one thing that we found, as I said, like about irja, it's a very clear statement and also very clear reports mentioned in Kitab al-Iman. He mentioned a lot of things, and then he mentioned al-irja itself in Kitab al-Iman, and he brought some reports on irja. Yes, I agree. This is the same point that Dr. Brown raised about like some reports in al-Bukhari. We can see like he used maybe his critical methodology or maybe just like method criticism or legal expertise to verify these hadiths. But then the question here in terms of epistemology of testimony is the way here or the methodology based on perception, based on senses, as we can see in the epistemology of testimony, as we can see in the debate between Thomas Reid and David Hume, and then the followers of these and the people commenting on these discussions. So however, Mu'tazila for me, it's very clear, especially in Al-Balkhi Kitab, Qabul al-Akhbar, we can see this very clearly in the very brief introduction, 2 pages into his book, Qabul al-Akhbar. He said, we cannot accept any hadith contradict with 2 universal kalami of their 5 principles. The first one is Tawheed, the unity of God, and the divine justice. So these cannot be contradicted with any hadith, even though if Rasul himself, just like they coming to confirm these principles. So we cannot accept, if we hear immediately the Prophet saying that, we need to make maybe interpretation or just like maneuver to understand that. So Mu'tazila, yes, that's clearly, but then there is a gradual understanding, gradual methodology in terms of Mu'tazila. We can see al-Basri later becoming just like as like Ash'arite and very close to Shafi'i opinion on terms of ahadith. But he still remained with this camp, especially with these 2 universal principles. So I think this is a very important example you mentioned, and I don't know where we can locate that. I don't know, Muhammad, what do you think?
I'm not sure I have an answer. I guess what I would maybe re-emphasize is, you know, I think it's very difficult to try to kind of read in, and this is one of the problems of trying to do a work like this. Is you're almost like reading in contemporary ideas, contemporary conversations backwards through time. And so you obviously have to do some interpretation of history. You're probably going to go out on a limb and say things and try to figure out exactly what was going on in the mind of, for example, Imam al-Bukhari. That would be very difficult. So I think there's room for flexibility there. There's room to see, well, maybe this thesis, you know, has certain limitations. There's some evidence that contradicts that, right? How do you deal with that? And I don't think that it's at least for me, I don't think it's obvious one way or another. And it's not like clear cut. But I think the way that I personally dealt with it and how I kind of grappled with it as I talked to Dr. Islam as we were writing this paper is really an issue of emphasis. I think an issue of emphasis is really important, and where any given individual, whether they're modern or they're historical, where they're placing their emphasis on sources of knowledge, on what yields knowledge, what is knowledge. And I think what complicates things even further, and I'm not here saying like complicate it so that you could just say whatever we want, but I think even understanding what reductionism and non-reductionism is a place of debate, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think it just complicates things. I think for me, the paper and the project in general is, I think these types of conversations make us think in all of our various fields more critically about what is happening.
And if I can just do one more, I'm going to outdo my friend here. In Jonathan Brown's book, The Canonization of Bukhari and Muslim, on page 94, in a footnote, always read the footnotes. That's what we learned in Chicago. On page 94, he addresses an anecdote that it seems you all take as a historical fact, that Ibn Hanbal, Yahya ibn Ma'in, and I believe Ali ibn Madini sat around and read a draft of Bukhari's Sahih. And I'm not going to say what Jack says about that. I just gave you the reference. But I'm kind of curious, do you really think those three men sat around and read a draft of his Sahih? Baghdad, I guess, or where, I guess, is that where it happened?
I don't think they sit and discuss all of these issues, but this like what we can witness if we can collect all of these statements by Ibn Ma'in and Ahmed Hanbal here, like internal discourse of the 3rd century, and from here and there is like a general sense that maybe each one of these give a credit to al-Bukhari, and maybe in obvious, direct or indirect way. So that's why I think Al-Uqayli here put them all together and say, okay, look, I've heard all of these people, and especially these three critics, said this and that. And then for him, consider, even though Al-Bukhari surpassed them. So I don't think that's like just like maybe sitting or there is any evidence. So as I said maybe earlier, all statements and all quotations, mostly we can see later, not immediate or direct transmission through maybe Al-Bukhari or, so Al-Bukhari himself, like when he talking about his dream and encounter with Ishaq bin Rahoya and all of these narrated by a later generation. So yes, I think this would be also, I think, a good point to maybe examine the authority or the authentication of all of these statements.
I'm happy to step back.
So maybe we should see if there are any questions in the audience. I actually have a question myself, or at least an observation that might pick up on one of the questions by Yusuf Bakar, talking to all the panelists, but also Jack Brown, about the discrediting and conforming the reliability of narrators, Jarh and Ta'dil. And that was my question, actually, that you know, it's a simple matter of translation. When I, as an English speaker, reading your article, your chapter, it's going to be about testimony. It goes to court. You know, it's about court, and I think you have to take it back from the court a little bit. I think you have to put quotation marks around it, and but also there are also some opportunities in the court, in the Muslim court, in the Mahkamah, and the opportunities are under the heading of Jarh and Ta'dil, which is the fuqaha share Jarh and Ta'dil with the hadith scholars. And it's every bit as important in evaluating witness testimony in a court as it is for hadith. But that's only in a couple of madhabs, the two I work on. And Scott works on one of them. So the Shafi'is and the Zaydis both take Jarh and Ta'dil in court and as a technique for evaluating witness evidence. And the adala of a witness is absolutely crucial. And if witness knowledge, shahada, is sort of defined as being a form of knowledge. It's only a form of knowledge if the witness is adil. So, and I think I'm just trying to think of how the difference is between the hadith situation and the court situation. But one major difference is who receives it, who's the listener. In the court, it's the judge. And that's a different kind of thing. You sometimes wrote about that this individual judged, the hadith was judged, but it wasn't judged. It was heard, it was interpreted, something else, some other kind of genre of work was being done. It wasn't judgment. And so I think that, and also, you know, even the genres themselves of shahada and hadith are compared by al-Mawardi, for example. You know, and so I think you need to circle out a little bit in the world, both of the Islamic world, in terms of these two disciplines have the same technology, same analytic world that they enjoy and apply, and that there are actually madhabs that do that. And I have my court records. I can show you court records where you have jarh witnesses, and a jarh witness is all about knowledge. It's why a jarh witness is given privilege over any number of ta'dil witnesses, a single jarh. There's a whole world there that I think might be illuminating for the hadith world. But the other thing I would say is that in invoking this world of testimony in this English language philosophy work, I'm sort of curious about what are their genres that they work on. Are they're thinking about court witnesses with testimony, or are they thinking about something else? I think you should go there and tell us a little bit about that field. In other words, if you're going to make a really, in the book project, to really compare and really to be inspired by that field, we have to know more about it. I mean, it's all we have is a word, and then the translation is problematic. Anyway, thanks.
Yes, that's a very important point, and yes, the term itself. So first, when we read the literature on the epistemology of testimony, we blurred what the meaning of his testimony here, and then we got a lot of quotations, and especially started from a philosopher in I think called Qadi, and he said the testimony here just about any report we hear in our daily life, like when the dad telling his son that the weather is snowing right now. So there's a testimony. So they open the field of testimony to any daily life report. So then later, and especially I think if Muhammad can confirm that with another philosopher, I think his name is maybe Elizabeth Freaker, said is not just connected with this meaning of like daily life report, also with books. Like when you read book is a testimony. So when just like what we call wijada right now. So in Ilm al-Hadith, so that when you read a book, so can consider this book as a testimony. Can you rely? Can you verify? Can you believe? Or can you just justify? So these people taking the concept of testimony from court as we understood, as we like usually understood, to any report that we heard. Like if you go to the New York subway and asking where I can go to, maybe to one place, this a testimony in that way. So if I got your question correctly, I don't know. Mohammed, can you add?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great comment and a great question. Actually, I would actually separate it out as two different and interrelated areas that need to be focused on. Number one, I think, is definitely one of the main areas that the testimony literature focuses on is the nature of testimony. What is testimony? And as Dr. Islam pointed out, I think it's very clear that those in kind of contemporary epistemological circles don't agree about what the nature of testimony is, and they have very different philosophical underpinnings of what they're coming to it with. Some of them in like based on like speech act theory, and there's just a lot of different ways that they're approaching it. But one of the things that becomes clear is that they're not just talking about legal testimony. That I think is pretty clear. A question I have, I don't have an answer to it, is when did this term develop? You know, where did it start? And what confused me, and I brought this up to Dr. Islam a number of times, is as you said, the question of shahada in Arabic is brought up in comparison, in contrast to the question of riwayah and akhbar. In fact, Shafi'i mentions it in al-Risala. And there's this kind of interesting back and forth between whom and whoever this other, you know, arch nemesis on the other side is, in which he says, you know, he uses shahada as an example to make a point about akhbar. And then he says, but akhbar and shahada are not the same thing. I'm not saying they're the same thing. Akhbar are an asl in and of themselves. And I thought it was really interesting that shahada, you know, makes a presentation of itself in the Risala of Shafi'i. And then, you know, this field being known as testimony, not really just talking about legal testimony. Although to be fair, there are books on legal testimony. So it's not that that's not important, it's just not only. The second point that I'll bring, and forgive me for going long, is I think there's a whole nother area to focus on in terms of, and I'm trying to remember the term that I'm using for it currently, but kind of just the for now, let me put a placeholder, kind of the evidential place that reports play, right? And that kind of would overlap with court proceedings, et cetera. And that's its own kind of area that needs to be focused on as well.
Shall we take a few questions from the audience now?
Absolutely. Hi, folks. We do have a good collection of questions, and I want to do them as close to as order as possible. If the panelists can actually see the questions, you can press Q&A. But I think we should start with the first one. I'm going to hit answer live.
Is this Yusuf Ali?
Yes. So Sanam, recently a well-known Turkish Muslim journalist, saying that Sunni Muslims were dogmatically wed to hadith books written hundreds of years after the Prophet, peace be upon him. Is this an accurate characterization of Sunni views on hadith, or the origin of hadith books to begin with?
Maybe we should take a couple of the questions.
Can people just respond to questions? Can panelists just like respond to certain
Sure,
questions?
I think so. Yeah.
Or I mean, I don't want to go first, but I mean, I can go first if no one else is ready.
Your book does such a good job of speaking to this. So
I was trying to get one of my kids to bring Scott's book up, but they couldn't find it despite its bright red cover. But yeah. So I mean, there's a couple of questions here which I can try and answer really quickly. The thing about this, the Turkish Muslim journalists, I think it was Mustafa Akul, said especially Muslims are dogmatically wed to hadith collections, especially Bukhari. You know, I think that my response would be that, you know, that's just not true because, you know, we know it's not like all the madhabs of law and theology, the second Sahih Bukhari come out, they're like, oh, we have to totally adjust our madhab of law and theology. You know, there's all sorts of ways of saying, well, that hadith doesn't mean what you, and they sincerely, you know, not just, you know, playing or engaging in mental gymnastics, but that they didn't interpret these the same way that either the author or other scholars did. Harold Motsky, I think that's an interesting question. I think that Motsky was really, what he did in a lot of ways, I think, was to really put in the same kind of work in terms of breadth of reading that like a Muslim critic, let's say like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani would have done. I mean, he really looked at a lot of sources, and when he looked at a lot of sources, he found that there was actually, you know, a common link that was earlier than people thought before. And he also, you know, realized that a lot of these transmissions actually were fairly historically, like the transmission process was historically reliable process in the sense that you could trust that a certain transmitter had actually gotten something by a certain chain. You could chase that chain back to a common link. So I think he was, you know, he said many times in his writings that, you know, he's not a, you know, dogmatic Muslim who thinks that hadiths are all true. I mean, he says, that's not my interest. He's interested in dating when you can say with kind of an historical critical method, when you can date this hadith as circulating, not whether or not the Prophet said it. I think something to answer, I think the Shabir Abbas question, also to answer Brink's question a little bit, which is this: why does he narrate from certain Shiites and Kharijites?
I think that in both cases of court testimony and in narration, in kind of authentication and narration, is these scholars are always up against reality, right? So there's always a what you might call like consequence-based reasoning, right? Which is that if you say that anybody who had Shiite beliefs and had Khawarij beliefs and had Qadarite beliefs is out of the question, you're going to lose too many narrators. You're not going to be able to transmit the Sharia, right? And same thing with in court testimony, when in later centuries, like in the 1200s and 1300s in Al-Andalus, or later, even also at the same time in Syria, you can see this writing in the writing of a lot of jurists. They started talking about the problem of not being able to find anybody who actually meets the madhab standards for upright and adala, upright standing to be a witness in court. And so the question is, that we just have to drop the standards, because otherwise we're not going to be able to do law, and we're not going to protect people's rights. So I think there's always a kind of enthymeme, or a kind of an implied syllogism, where the unstated premise is the kind of reality of what that they have to produce results and protect something.
Thank you for those comments. Everyone, if you can, panelists, if you want to select any questions specifically, you're welcome to. I can also read a few for you guys to see who'd like to go.
Can I answer one of the questions?
Can you rephrase it really quickly, just because I don't think the audience is reading the questions. So you can rephrase it.
Yeah, I just lost it. It was about critical theory and
let's see.
Justice. Yeah, here. 1A, I guess I didn't see there was a 1B. Is there a relationship between postmodernism? So, okay, I wasn't planning to answer that one. Do either apply to civil rights and social justice, or considering progress? Yeah, there does seem to be a growing literature that has to deal with social justice. For example, Miranda Fricker, not to be confused with Elizabeth Fricker, who was also cited earlier in the discussion, has a book. I don't have the title off the top of my head, but it's something like Epistemic Injustice, but basically she talks about testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, which also I think is a very, very important part of these conversations. And, where should we as, human beings, whether that's in a normative sense or in a descriptive sense, how should we be dealing with speakers? Because that's kind of how, when they talk about testimony, they talk about speakers and hearers, kind of how like in hadith, they talk about the sheikh, right, as the one who's narrating. They call him the speaker and the hearer. So what type of attitude, what type of epistemic judgment, right? I guess maybe we should avoid the word judgment, but epistemic outlook we should have towards people who are speaking. So that's an important part. And I think it has a lot to do in it. And I also think it actually interplays strongly with what Dr. Brown was saying about Motsky's work. I don't remember exactly where I read this, but one of the things that really struck me about Motsky's work is when he talks about, I think he kind of expresses this kind of suspended judgment approach until he kind of, uses other means to kind of check, is he talks about these kind of various epistemic systems for trying to investigate the same questions, right? And so is it unjust for us to approach hadith in specific ways without giving it a certain amount of the chance to speak for itself, or the chance to make the case for itself? I think those are important questions that need further research.
So Sarah, you want to read one or two more, and we have to wrap it up.
Yeah, so we also have a hand raised, but let's get to a few more questions because they were sent a while ago throughout the talk, which have been awesome. So this to the authors: was the redactional criticism methodology of Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim a discussion among the Muslim scholars of the pre-modern era? I'll put it in the chat box too.
So you're saying that sorry to interpret the question. Is basically you're asking, is the redaction that people do, that the authors, that Bukhari and Muslim did when they put together their books, or that other later people did in doing redactions of their books?
That's a good question. I can actually see if I can call upon that Armand Kuru to maybe speak a little bit more about what he meant. Just a moment. Armand Kuru. Did you want to mention anything, Armand?
Yes, sure, I would love to. Sending my greetings from Berlin, Germany. And my question was, you know, I read an article a while ago. I forgot the name of the author, but he basically made a point that Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim didn't just collect all the hadiths which were in their, according to their methodology, Sahih. So they had a kind of redactional criticism, which hadiths they put in there and which not. And that's a kind of discussion in academia right now, but where a discussion in the pre-modern, among the pre-modern Muslim scholars. That's my basic question.
Should I answer?
Please.
Okay, so just we need to know what's the meaning by reductionism when we say reductionism. So it's like could be a fake term and could be maybe a clear term. So the idea of reductionism, when you use perception, inference, and sense to reject, verify, and or to accept any report. So then in this term, or can we consider al-Bukhari and Muslim reductionist or not? Yes, if they had a plan to put and to select and choose some ahadith and to exclude others. So yes, but based on what? Based on other reports, based on defects, based on flaws, based on the report themselves. So this is a question. If their resources, their methodology based on reports, based on just testimony, then they are not reductionist. They are just hybrid. And for sure, there's I think the question coming, like after reading all papers on reductionism, so any usage or any source coming outside of perception, any coming outside of reasoning, this is not reductionism. So if you based your authority and your acceptance on reports, then you are between hybrid and non-reductionist. So a non-reductionist, yes, they use something like, they don't put any positive words on here, but they said, we need to see undefeated defeaters. Okay, if there's no any undefeated defeaters, yes, we can accept that. So this like the only shart, the only conditions they put for non-reductionists, and some of them very strict non-reductionists. They accept any reports as kids accept any reports from their dad, but this like very gullible and simple, shallow and childlike viewpoint. So I think al-Bukhari and Muslim, if you consider them reductionists in this way, that's not, I think, a correct term. Yes, you can consider them hybrid. They maybe, especially al-Bukhari, use the evaluation system, the background evaluation system, or intersubjective agreement, or this is the loops that we talked already in the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we should leave it at that. I mean, we can only so much we can do on Zoom without. In an hour and a half, I think, is a good effort. And we'll leave some questions unanswered, but that's the name of the game, I think. So thank you all. Thank you, Assam. Thank you, Muhammad.
Thanks for inviting me, and it was wonderful seeing everybody, if only on computer.
Thank you. It was really great. Thank you all for inviting us and for letting us take part in this.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jack, for this generous commentaries. And I hope I receive from you, if you write anything on this paper, would be an amazing and great opportunity to understand and maybe to advance the paper. Please do it. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Night, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.